Richard had always believed that life was heavier on some shoulders than others. He was 22, but the weight of his days felt older than his age. Born in Philadelphia, he grew up in Kensington, a neighborhood known for broken sidewalks, boarded-up houses, and a silent war against drugs that seemed to swallow entire families overnight. His earliest memories weren't of toys or playgrounds, but of sirens echoing in the night, and of his mother whispering prayers that tomorrow might be kinder. At the age of 12, Richard was diagnosed with a condition that slowly weakened his legs. The doctors had told him it was reversible, that with proper treatment and therapy he could one day walk again. But proper treatment meant money, and money was something his family never had. His father had left when Richard was 7, unable to bear the financial and emotional toll of poverty. That left Richard and his mother to fend for themselves. By 15, Richard was in a wheelchair. At first he hated it. He hated the stares, the whispered pity, the way children on the block pointed and laughed. But as the years went by, he realized that the chair was not a prison, it was a tool. It carried him through long stretches of broken pavement, through bus rides where drivers sometimes didn't stop because of time. It carried him to corners where he sold candy and snacks, one piece at a time, to strangers rushing through their own storms. His routine was brutal but predictable. Every morning he would wake up early in their small one-bedroom apartment. His mother would already be gone, and he would sit by the window for a moment, looking at the city's grey skyline. Then he would pack his backpack with chocolate bars, gum, and small bags of chips, and head out. He knew which corners were busier during morning rush hour, which subway exits were kinder to him, and which convenience stores allowed him to wait by the entrance without chasing him away. Richard had learned to smile even when he didn't feel like it. A smile made people stop. A smile made them drop $1 or $2 into his hand. He needed at least $30 a day just to cover rent, food, and the smallest medical supplies. Every penny beyond that, he carefully saved in a jar hidden under his bed, his treatment jar. He knew the road would be long, maybe years, but every coin inside that jar felt like a piece of his future legs. What Richard feared most wasn't pain. He had grown used to it. It wasn't even poverty. Poverty was an old companion by now. What he feared was becoming invisible. He feared that one day the world would simply pass him by, that no one would see him as a man, as a dreamer, as someone worth remembering. And yet, deep inside, he carried a quiet flame. He remembered the times he had seen people fall on the streets, overdosing or collapsing from hunger, and he had felt powerless to help. He remembered nights when kids younger than him begged for food, and he had nothing left to give. These moments haunted him. He promised himself that if he ever had the strength, if life ever gave him the chance, he would be the one to act. He would not be just a bystander in the face of suffering. That promise, buried in the silence of his heart, was about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. Richard's mornings always began the same way. The metallic squeak of his wheelchair filled the cramped apartment as he maneuvered toward the kitchen, where the smell of stale bread and yesterday's coffee lingered. He lived in a small government-subsidized building on the edge of Kensington, Philadelphia, an area that had long since become synonymous with America's opioid epidemic. Just outside his window, he could hear the desperate shuffle of footsteps, the faint crackle of aluminum foil, and the haunting cries of people battling their inner demons on the sidewalks. This was his world. Not by choice, but by circumstance. Richard often thought about how life had pushed him into this corner, how the accident had stolen his mobility and his chance to live like everyone else. But what gnawed at him most was not the wheelchair. It was the helplessness, the feeling of being a spectator in a city drowning in suffering. He could see the overdoses, the fights, the broken families, and yet he could do nothing except sell candy. With a battered backpack and a box full of chocolate bars bought wholesale from a discount store, Richard rolled himself out into the streets. He had learned to map every curb, every crack in the sidewalk, every place where his wheels might get stuck. The city was unfriendly to people like him, but he had adapted. "Candy for $1, help support local," he called out, his voice rehearsed, not too desperate, but enough to draw a glance. Most people walked by. Some sneered. A few dropped coins or crumpled bills into his hand, taking a bar in return. It wasn't much, but it kept him afloat. Every dollar saved was a brick in the fragile wall he was building toward his dream, a surgery that could give him back his legs. Doctors had told him the condition was reversible, with the right treatment, with the right rehab, with the right care, but the cost was astronomical for someone like him. Insurance wouldn't cover it, and charity programs had waiting lists that stretched for years. Still, Richard held on to hope. At night, back in his apartment, he would count every dollar he had earned, stacking them neatly inside an old shoebox under his bed. The money was far from enough, but the ritual gave him a sense of control, a fragile lifeline to the future he dreamed of. But Richard wasn't only motivated by his own suffering. He remembered too well the injustices he had seen and endured. As a child, he had watched his father, a construction worker, lose his life after an on-site accident. The company never paid what they owed. His mother worked double shifts in a diner, her health eroding until the day she collapsed and never returned home. From that day on, Richard had grown to see the world as a place where the vulnerable were abandoned. The homeless man beaten by teenagers for fun, the single mother evicted with her kids on a cold night, the addict who overdosed on a corner and was left until paramedics arrived too late. Richard saw it all, and deep inside, he wished he could do something. Selling candy didn't change lives, but when people stopped to talk to him, sometimes he offered more than chocolate. He offered an ear, a kind word, a smile. He had become known in certain corners as the candy man in the wheelchair, a familiar face in a neighborhood where most people were invisible. But at the end of every day, when he closed his eyes, Richard knew it wasn't enough. One night, sitting in his apartment, the rain tapping against the window like impatient fingers, he felt a wave of despair wash over him. He stared at his shoebox of savings. It looked so small, so insignificant against the mountain he had to climb. He wondered if he would ever walk again, if he would ever escape this cycle of survival. And then, almost as if destiny itself had been waiting for that moment of weakness, his life began to shift. It started with a scream. Richard had been rolling back home after a long day of selling. The streets of Kensington were darker than usual, the streetlights flickering, the air heavy with the sour stench of garbage and smoke. He was near the corner of Allegheny Avenue when he heard it, a high-pitched scream cutting through the night. He froze. His heart raced. Screams in Kensington weren't rare. Most of the time, people looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. Survival demanded indifference. But something in that cry pierced through him, sharper than any he had heard before. Without thinking, he pushed his wheels faster, the chair rattling against the uneven pavement. As he turned the corner, he saw her. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, surrounded by two men whose bodies loomed like shadows over her. Her blonde hair caught the dim glow of a neon sign, her arms flailing as she tried to break free. One of the men grabbed her purse, while the other blocked her path. Richard's chest tightened, his mind screamed, "Don't get involved, you can't fight, you'll get hurt." But his heart whispered something else. He had always dreamed of being the one who made a difference, the one who stepped up when others didn't. And here it was, his chance. With trembling hands, Richard shouted, "Hey, leave her alone!" The men turned. Their eyes scanned him, sitting in his chair, frail compared to their towering frames. They laughed. One of them muttered, "Mind your own business, cripple." But the woman's eyes locked onto Richard's. They weren't just filled with fear, they were pleading, a silent cry for anyone to help. And in that moment, something ancient and unshakable stirred within him. Richard gripped the rims of his wheels tighter and prepared to act. Not because he thought he could win, but because he couldn't stay silent. Because if he didn't try, he would never forgive himself. The laughter of the two men echoed down the alleyway, cruel and sharp, like knives scraping against concrete. Richard's stomach twisted. His hands were clammy against the cold metal rims of his wheelchair. He knew how the world saw him. A crippled street vendor, powerless, forgettable. And yet, despite his fear, something inside him burned. A fire he hadn't felt in years. The woman's eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his. She was no longer a stranger. She was a human thread tied to his own suffering, his own sense of injustice. If he turned away now, he wouldn't just abandon her, he would abandon himself. "Leave her alone," Richard repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying down the narrow street. The man holding the purse sneered. "Or what? What are you going to do, huh?" Richard swallowed hard. He didn't know the answer, but his hands were already moving, pushing his chair forward, closing the distance. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. The second man stepped toward him, his heavy boots slamming against the wet pavement. "Back off, Wheels. This ain't your fight." But Richard didn't stop. He had no weapon, no strength to match theirs, only the weight of his conviction. And sometimes that was enough. He reached into his backpack, not for money or candy, but for the heavy lock he used to secure his chair at night. A crude weapon, but one that fit perfectly in his hand. He raised it, his arm trembling, and shouted again, "Let her go." The men hesitated. Maybe it was the fire in his voice. Maybe it was the unexpected defiance from someone they had written off as harmless. For a split second they faltered. And that was all the woman needed. She twisted sharply, elbowing the man holding her purse. His grip loosened, and she broke free, stumbling toward Richard. He instinctively reached out, pulling her behind his chair, as if his frail body could be a shield. The men cursed, one of them spitting on the ground. "This ain't over," the taller one growled. But instead of charging, they backed away, their eyes darting between Richard's makeshift weapon and the approaching glow of headlights, turning onto the street. Within seconds, they melted into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of retreating footsteps. Silence settled over the alley, broken only by the woman's ragged breathing. She collapsed against the wall, her hands trembling, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. Richard lowered the lock, his arms aching, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. His chest heaved, not from physical exertion, but from the storm of emotions surging inside him. For the first time in years, he had stood, no, fought, for something bigger than himself. The woman looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile but filled with sincerity. "You saved me." Richard shook his head. "I didn't do much." "You did everything," she said firmly. Her name, he soon learned, was Mariana Ellis, though everyone called her Mary. She wasn't from Kensington. Her clothes, her accent, even her mannerisms spoke of a different world. Later, Richard would discover she was the daughter of a wealthy businessman whose empire stretched across the city. But in that moment, she was simply a terrified young woman, and he was the stranger who refused to look away. Mary insisted on walking him home, though Richard tried to protest. "You've been through enough tonight," he said. "So have you," she replied softly. The walk, or rather the roll, back to his building was quiet at first. But slowly, Mary began to talk. She admitted she had wandered into Kensington out of desperation. Her best friend had been swallowed by addiction, and Mary had come searching for her, refusing to believe she was truly gone. Richard listened, his heart heavy. He had seen countless faces lost to the same darkness. Her story wasn't unique, yet her determination was. When they reached his apartment, she paused. "I don't even know your name." "Richard," he said. "Just Richard." "Well, Richard, I owe you more than I can ever repay." He gave a faint smile. "You don't owe me anything. Just be safe." She hesitated, then leaned down and hugged him. It was quick, but in that moment, Richard felt something he hadn't in years. As she walked away into the night, Richard sat at his window long after, staring at the shoebox under his bed. For years, his fight had been only for himself, for the surgery, for the dream of walking again. But now, for the first time, he wondered if fate had something bigger in store for him, because when he closed his eyes, he didn't see his own suffering. He saw Mary's eyes, wide with fear, pleading for help, and he knew he couldn't ignore the call. The following morning felt strangely ordinary at first. Richard woke to the sound of buses groaning down Kensington Avenue, the same noise that had been his alarm clock for years. His mother, Rosa, shuffled around their small kitchen, her voice humming faintly as she reheated leftover rice for breakfast. But something was different. Richard's body was still buzzing from the night before. The memory of the alley lingered, replaying in fragments, the shouts, the fear, the swing of his lock in his trembling hand, and Mary's desperate eyes. He had felt alive in a way he hadn't in years, not because he was in danger, but because he had acted. "Richard, eat something before it gets cold," Rosa called, placing a chipped bowl on the table. He wheeled himself over, his muscles aching, though he hid it with a faint smile. "Thanks, Mom." She studied him carefully. "You're quieter today. Something happened." Richard hesitated. His mother worried enough about him as it was, about the chair, the illness, the long nights selling candy. Telling her about the alley would only deepen her fears. "Just tired," he replied, spooning rice into his mouth. But even as he said it, part of him wanted to tell her. Part of him wanted to share the feeling of being more than a forgotten kid in a wheelchair. That chance never came. Because only minutes later, someone knocked on their door. Not the quick rattle of a neighbor or the lazy rhythm of a delivery boy. This knock was firm, deliberate, almost commanding. Rosa froze, a dish still in her hand. Who could that be at this hour? Richard shrugged. Maybe the landlord. But when Rosa opened the door, it wasn't the landlord. It was a tall man in a tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back, his eyes sharp yet tired, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. Behind him, a sleek black car idled on the curb, an unfamiliar sight in their run-down block. "Good morning," the man said, his deep voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'm looking for Richard." Rosa's hand tightened on the doorknob. "Who's asking?" The man hesitated, then stepped forward. "My name is Paul Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Rosa, but Richard, rolling into the doorway, sensed immediately that this was someone from a different world. Everything about him, the pressed suit, the polished shoes, the faint smell of expensive cologne screamed wealth. But his eyes told another story. "I'm Richard," he said cautiously. "What's this about?" Paul's gaze softened as it landed on him. "You don't know me, son, but you saved my daughter's life last night." Richard blinked, his chest tightening. "Your daughter, Mary." "Yes," Paul nodded. "Her full name is Mariana Ellis Whitmore. She's been missing for months. We feared the worst." His voice broke just slightly before he steadied himself again. "And then, last night, someone we've never met, stepped in when no one else would." Rosa covered her mouth with her hand. "My God!" Richard felt the weight of Paul's words. Saving her had been instinct, not strategy. He hadn't thought about who she was or who she belonged to. She had simply been a person in danger. "I only did what anyone should do," Richard said quietly. Paul shook his head firmly. "No, most would have looked away, most did look away, but you didn't. And for that I owe you more than I can ever repay." There was a pause. The alley's echoes still haunted Richard's ears, and now here was the father of the girl he'd pulled from the brink, standing in his tiny apartment, a world of privilege colliding with his world of scarcity. Paul's gaze drifted to Richard's chair. He hesitated before asking, "How long have you—" "All my life," Richard interrupted. He hated the pity that usually followed that question, but this time something in Paul's eyes wasn't pity. It was recognition. "Is it permanent?" Richard inhaled, his throat tightening. "It doesn't have to be. There's a surgery that could help, but it's expensive." Paul's jaw clenched. He looked around the small, worn apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the quiet dignity Rosa tried to hold on to despite everything. "How much?" Paul asked. Richard's heart skipped. "Why?" "Because if there's a chance that you can walk," Paul said, his voice steady now, "I want to give it to you. After what you did for my daughter, this is the least I can do." Rosa gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "Sir, that's too much. We can't accept—" But Paul lifted a hand. "This isn't charity. This is gratitude. A debt I can never fully repay. Let me help your son." Richard sat in silence, his thoughts spinning. For years he had scraped coins into that shoebox under his bed, dreaming of a surgery that always seemed just out of reach. And now, a stranger, a millionaire no less, was offering to make it real. But a part of him recoiled. Accepting would mean stepping into a world he didn't understand, a world where he might not belong. And deep down a voice whispered, "Why you? Why now?" Still, when he looked at Paul's eyes, haunted, weary, yet hopeful, he felt something stir inside him. Perhaps this wasn't coincidence. Perhaps this was the destiny he had been waiting for. "All right," Richard said finally, his voice low but firm. "I'll accept. Paul exhaled, almost in relief. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand. Richard reached out, their grip firm, a bridge forming between two lives that never should have crossed, but now would never separate. That handshake marked the beginning of 30 days that neither of them would ever forget. 30 days of lessons, confessions, and transformations that would redefine the meaning of wealth, strength, and redemption. And though Richard didn't know it yet, his journey as a reluctant hero had only just begun. Don't forget that this is a fictional novel. The first time Richard rode in Paul Whitmore's car, he thought he'd stepped into another universe. The black Cadillac Escalade gleamed under the weak Philadelphia sun, its leather seats smooth and perfumed with the faint scent of cedar. Richard had to hoist himself awkwardly into the seat, his wheelchair folded and stowed carefully in the trunk by the driver. For someone used to the rickety hum of city buses, the quiet purr of the engine felt almost alien. Paul sat across from him, his posture impeccable, his phone buzzing with a constant stream of messages he barely acknowledged. Yet every so often his gaze flicked toward Richard, studying him as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You're not what I expected," Paul finally said, slipping the phone into his pocket. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" Paul smirked faintly. "Someone bitter, angry at the world. But you're calm." Richard shrugged. "Being angry doesn't change anything. It just makes the chair feel heavier." The honesty in his voice hung in the air. Paul nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if he understood more than he cared to admit. Their first stop was not a hospital, as Richard assumed, but a cafe in Center City. Not the kind Richard ever set foot in. This place had chandeliers, polished floors, waiters in crisp uniforms. The menu was in cursive script, and half the items sounded more like poetry than food. Richard scanned the options, his cheeks heating. "You got anything that's not French?" Paul chuckled, the sound genuine. "Try the Eggs Benedict. You'll like it." When the food arrived, Richard stared at the delicate arrangement, poached eggs on toasted English muffins, draped with hollandaise sauce. It looked more like art than breakfast. He cut into it cautiously, then took a bite. His eyes widened, he admitted. "That's not bad." Paul leaned back, watching him with a smile that was almost paternal. "Richard, food is a lot like life. Sometimes it looks intimidating, complicated. But once you actually taste it, it's not so scary." Richard rolled his eyes. "Is that your millionaire wisdom talking?" "Maybe," Paul replied, his tone light but his eyes thoughtful. The day wasn't about food, it was about conversation. Paul asked questions about Richard's childhood, his routines, his mother. Richard spoke cautiously at first, but gradually the words flowed. He told Paul about the long nights on the streets, the sting of rejection when people avoided his eyes, the small victories of selling just enough to buy groceries. And Paul listened. Not distracted, not half engaged, but truly listened. For Richard, that was rarer than money. In return, Paul shared pieces of his own story. Not the glossy version the newspapers loved to print, but the cracks in between. He spoke of building his empire brick by brick, of sleepless nights spent fighting off competitors, of a marriage strained by ambition. He confessed, almost in a whisper, that despite the millions, despite the hotels that bore his name, he often felt like a fraud, successful on paper, but hollow inside. Richard studied him, surprised. "You? Hollow? You've got everything." Paul's gaze dropped to his coffee. "Everything money can buy, but not everything that matters." The word stayed with Richard long after. Over the next week, their lives intertwined in ways neither expected. One afternoon, Paul brought Richard to his office, a towering glass building downtown, with marble floors that echoed under polished shoes. Employees whispered as they passed, their eyes darting curiously at the young man in the wheelchair beside their boss. Richard felt out of place, like a stray cat wandering into a cathedral, but Paul walked beside him with quiet pride, introducing him not as a charity case, but as my friend. At one point, Richard leaned close and muttered, "You don't have to call me that." Paul looked at him steady. "But you are." The simple words hit harder than Richard expected. In the evenings, Richard showed Paul his world. He insisted on it. "If you're going to drag me into your fancy life, you should see mine." So Paul found himself rolling down Kensington Avenue with Richard one Friday night. Neon lights flickered against cracked sidewalks, dealers loitered on corners, and the faint smell of smoke and despair clung to the air. Paul's tailored suit looked almost absurd against the backdrop. "Why bring me here?" Paul asked, keeping close. "Because this is the world you don't see from your penthouse," Richard replied. "This is where people like Mary end up, where hope comes to die." They passed a woman slumped against a wall, her arms dotted with needle marks. Paul flinched. Richard didn't. "I've seen her before," Richard murmured. "Last week she bought candy from me, said it was for her little brother. I didn't believe her. But I gave her 2 extra pieces anyway." Paul swallowed hard. "How do you keep from losing hope?" Richard's eyes stayed on the woman. "By remembering I can't save everyone, but I can save someone." The weight of the words settled deep in Paul's chest. By the end of those first 10 days, something had shifted. Paul no longer looked at Richard with the eyes of a benefactor repaying a debt. He looked at him as an equal, maybe even as a mirror. And Richard, though still wary, began to see Paul not as a suit or a bank account, but as a man. Flawed, lonely, searching. They were 2 broken pieces, fitting together in ways neither expected. And somewhere in the silence between conversations, in the laughter over awkward meals, in the shared stares at the streets that shaped them differently, a bond began to form. A bond that would change both of their lives forever. The autumn air grew colder as weeks passed, painting the streets with shades of gold and red. Richard continued to sell his candies, but something within him had shifted. Every time he saw Mariana in the clinic, every conversation they shared, it was as if the world grew brighter. Yet in that brightness, shadows from his past also stirred, whispering reminders of all he had lost. Richard had not always been the man in the wheelchair on the corner of Kensington Avenue. Once, long ago, he had been a boy with fire in his heart and dreams that could light up the sky. His mother often told him that he was born with a helper's soul. She would laugh and say, "Richard, you weren't made for yourself, you were made for others." Those words stayed with him. Even as poverty pressed down on their family, Richard was the one who defended smaller kids from bullies at school. He was the one who gave his last sandwich to the boy who had nothing, but life had never been kind in return. When he was 17, Richard witnessed his best friend Daniel fall victim to the streets. Daniel had been smart, brilliant even, but the pull of fast money and the escape of drugs was stronger than the promise of school or hard work. Richard remembered the night he found him, trembling in an alley, his body consumed by addiction. He tried to pull Daniel out, but the system didn't care. Rehab beds were scarce. Support was a privilege, not a right. Daniel overdosed 2 months later. The injustice of it burned in Richard's heart for years. He had sworn then that he would never let himself become blind to the pain around him. But when illness struck his own body, leaving him bound to the chair, the guilt grew heavier. How many times had he sat watching the world fall apart and thought, if only I could walk, if only I could do more. Now with Mariana at his side, those memories resurfaced, not to haunt him, but to remind him of who he had always been. He wasn't just a man fighting for his own cure. He was someone born to help, to shield, to love in a world that had forgotten compassion. Mariana noticed the weight in his eyes one evening. They sat outside the clinic after her shift, the streetlights flickering above. "You've been quiet today," she said softly. Richard hesitated, then spoke. "Do you ever feel like destiny is cruel? No matter how much good you try to do, the world just keeps taking?" Mariana tilted her head. "I've seen cruelty, yes. But I've also seen miracles. Sometimes they look small, sometimes they take years to bloom. But I believe nothing good is ever lost." Her words struck something deep within him. He realized that meeting her wasn't coincidence. Maybe she was one of those miracles, proof that his story wasn't over, that the universe hadn't abandoned him after all. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to hope, not just for a cure, but for a life worth living again. A life where his pain could be transformed into purpose. A life where the helper's soul his mother spoke of could finally shine again. And as the leaves fell, covering the broken sidewalks of Kensington like a fragile blanket, Richard whispered a promise to himself. "I will rise. For Daniel, for Mum, for everyone I couldn't save, and for her." The first day of the arrangement felt surreal. Richard woke in his modest apartment, the familiar creak of the building mingling with the distant sirens of Kensington. He had spent years navigating the chaos outside these walls, but today was different. Today, Paul Whitmore was coming to oversee the first stage of what Richard secretly called the plan for walking again. At exactly 9 a.m., the black Cadillac pulled up outside. Paul stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a clipboard filled with schedules, charts, and plans. "Good morning, Richard," he said warmly. "Ready to get started?" Richard hesitated. The truth was, he was terrified. Not of the therapy itself, he had spent years in pain, but of failing again. He had seen enough dreams collapse in his life to know the sting of disappointment intimately. "I guess so," he muttered, wheeling himself toward the car. The drive to the rehabilitation clinic was filled with tension. Paul tried to lighten the mood with conversation about the city's architecture, the quirks of their mutual neighborhood, and stories of his own failed investments. Richard listened quietly, offering sarcastic quips that made Paul chuckle occasionally. It was a strange sort of friendship forming, one that bridged two completely different worlds. Upon arrival at the clinic, Richard's nerves intensified. The sterile smell, the whirring of machines and the polished floors reminded him of the distance between his life on the streets and the wealth that Paul inhabited. But he faced the challenge head-on. For the first time in years, he was doing something purely for himself, and for a future he hadn't dared imagine. The rehabilitation process was brutal. Every session tested his resolve, his patience, and his endurance. Muscles that had atrophied from years of immobility screamed in protest as he learned to stand, then take hesitant steps with parallel bars and supportive braces. Some days ended in tears. Frustration often boiled over, as progress seemed painfully slow. Yet Paul was always there, either by his side or checking in, ensuring that Richard never felt alone. "Remember," Paul would say during difficult sessions, "it's not the speed that matters, it's consistency. Every small victory is a step toward freedom." Richard began to understand that Paul was not merely a benefactor in his life. He was a mentor, a man who had faced the crushing weight of expectation and success only to find it hollow. In their conversations between sessions, Paul spoke candidly about the emptiness of wealth without purpose, about the isolation of his life, and the mistakes he had made, prioritizing business over family. "Money," Paul confessed one evening while they shared a quiet dinner in Richard's apartment, "can build empires, but it can't build love, loyalty, or integrity. Those have to be earned. And sometimes, they have to be found in the unlikeliest of places." Richard absorbed every word. For years he had survived on the streets, learning the value of human connection and the resilience required to endure suffering. Now, through Paul, he was discovering a different kind of education, one in strategy, discipline, and vision. In turn, Richard offered Paul lessons of his own, lessons about empathy, courage, and the strength to face personal demons despite limitations. Their evenings were filled with debates, reflections, and storytelling. Paul learned the names of every corner, every alley, every person Richard had helped over the years. Richard learned to navigate conversations about corporate politics, investments, and responsibilities he had never imagined for himself. They laughed, argued, and occasionally clashed. Two stubborn souls learning from one another, each reshaping the other's perception of the world. Meanwhile, Mariana's presence lingered like a guiding light in Richard's journey. Though she remained under medical supervision to recover fully from her past struggles, she often visited the clinic. She cheered him on during grueling physical exercises and shared glimpses of her progress, small victories that reminded him why every step, every moment of pain mattered. She became both a symbol of hope and a tangible representation of the good that could emerge from courage and compassion. One day, after a particularly exhausting session, Richard collapsed into a chair in the clinic's common area. His legs trembled uncontrollably, every fiber of his being protesting against the physical demand. Paul sat beside him, silent, waiting until Richard could catch his breath. Richard whispered finally, sweat dripping down his brow, "I never thought I'd feel like this again. Alive, hopeful. I didn't just want to walk. I wanted to feel like I mattered." Paul nodded. "And you do. More than you know. Not because of me or the money, but because of who you are. You've always mattered. Weeks passed. Progress was uneven, often frustrating, but undeniable. Richard began to move with more confidence, his wheelchair now a tool for transition rather than confinement. Paul witnessed the transformation, not just physically, but emotionally. He saw Richard's pride, his growing laughter, and the spark in his eyes that had been dimmed for years. It was a rebirth, and Paul felt a vicarious healing in observing it. By the end of the 30 days, Richard could stand independently for short stretches, take deliberate steps, and even walk with support along the corridors of the clinic. Mariana, now stronger and more confident, often joined him during exercises, her laughter echoing like a promise of life beyond the pain. Paul marveled at the courage and tenacity of the young man who had once been so limited by circumstance. The 30-day experiment had achieved more than physical rehabilitation. It had fostered a friendship that transcended social class, wealth, and life experience. Paul saw in Richard the embodiment of values he had long neglected: perseverance, empathy, and the courage to confront the unknown. Richard, in turn, discovered that wealth and power, when wielded responsibly, could amplify the good in the world rather than simply sustain ego. And as the 30 days drew to a close, Paul looked at Richard and said with quiet pride, "You've done more than regain mobility. You've reminded me what it means to be human." Richard smiled, exhaustion etched across his features, but also a deep, newfound sense of accomplishment. "And you've reminded me what it means to trust someone, completely." In that moment, in the shared silence of understanding and gratitude, it became clear. This was not just a story of recovery. It was a story of transformation, of humanity reaffirmed through connection, courage, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability. The first time Mariana returned to the streets where she had once wandered, she didn't recognize herself. The face in the mirror, pale but determined, reflected the shadows of the past she had long tried to forget. Addiction had stolen months from her life, but it hadn't stolen her will to fight. She had seen too much, endured too much, to let despair win. Richard had become more than a stranger who saved her life. He had become a mirror, reflecting courage she had long thought lost. And yet, for him, she realized, she was also a responsibility, one she willingly embraced. She couldn't forget that without his bravery, without the risk he had taken in that rainy alley. She might not have had a second chance. The early mornings were the hardest. Mariana struggled with therapy, counseling sessions, and the constant pull of old habits that had once controlled her. But Richard, newly emboldened by his own physical journey, became her quiet anchor. "You survived worse," he reminded her one morning, wheeling beside her as she took tentative steps in the rehab garden. "The streets didn't take you. You can take yourself back." Paul watched from the bench, noting the subtle transformations in both of them. He had seen Richard regain mobility, but the effect on Mariana was different. Where Richard's progress had been measured in physical milestones, Mariana's victories were emotional. Each smile, each laugh, each moment of clarity was a triumph over the past that had threatened to consume her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Richard one evening after a particularly grueling therapy session. Sweat clung to their skin, and the sun had dipped below the skyline, casting amber light across the clinic garden. Richard paused, considering the question. "Because someone once saved me. Not from a beating or addiction, but from thinking the world didn't care about me. And I can't ignore someone who needs saving, not when I know what it feels like to be alone." Mariana blinked, tears welling. "You're incredible." "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "Just human. You'll see soon. You're incredible too, stronger than you think." Their days became intertwined, a rhythm of therapy, conversation, and small adventures outside the clinic walls. Paul encouraged them both, introducing Mariana to routines she had never imagined: grocery trips, library visits, and even brief walks through the quieter streets of Philadelphia. Each step outside the familiar shadows of Kensington was a reclamation of life, of freedom. One afternoon, they arrived at a small community center where a program for recovering addicts offered art therapy and group discussion. Mariana hesitated at the entrance, memories of judgment and shame threatening to paralyze her. Richard, sensing her fear, simply squeezed her hand. "I'm right here. Let's do it together." Inside, She found herself surrounded by others who understood her struggle. Some shared stories that mirrored her own. Others listened quietly, nodding in empathy. Slowly, tentatively, she began to speak, recounting fragments of her journey. Richard and Paul watched as her voice gained strength, each word a victory against the silence that addiction had forced upon her. Evenings were quieter, reflective. Richard would roll to the window, gazing out at the city skyline, while Mariana sketched in her journal nearby. Paul often joined them, discussing plans for Richard's rehabilitation, business ventures, and occasionally offering candid insights into his own failings. One night, as the three sat together, Mariana spoke softly. "I never thought I'd see a future like this, where someone actually believes in me." Richard looked at her, his own eyes misting. "Belief is contagious. Once you have it, you can carry it forward. You're proof of that." The transformation was not instant. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Mariana's old fears surfaced with a vengeance. But Richard's courage, mirrored in his regained strength and renewed hope, became a guiding force. And in turn, Mariana's resilience rekindled Richard's faith in the power of human connection, a validation that their journey together was more than coincidence. It was destiny. Paul observed these dynamics quietly, aware that both young lives were shifting his perspective irrevocably. The power he had amassed over decades seemed meaningless compared to the profound growth and mutual respect he witnessed between Richard and Mariana. By the end of the 30 days, Mariana walked confidently, her steps deliberate, her gaze forward. Richard's own recovery had advanced to a level where independent movement was no longer a dream, but a reality. Together, they had rebuilt not only bodies, but spirits, forging bonds that money could never buy. And as they sat one evening on the rooftop of the rehab center, the city lights glittering below, Paul turned to them. "You've both changed my life," he admitted. "I thought I was helping, but in truth, you've taught me more than I could ever teach you." Richard smiled faintly, exhausted but triumphant. "We all needed saving in our own way." Mariana nodded, her eyes reflecting the promise of new beginnings, "and we found each other just in time." In that rooftop silence, with the cool breeze brushing their faces, Richard felt the culmination of everything he had endured. From the alleys of Kensington to the polished offices of Paul Whitmore, from the despair of addiction to the tentative hope of recovery, every moment had led to this. The rebirth of lives once fractured, now intertwined in courage, resilience, and an unbreakable bond. Don't forget, this is a fictional novel. 2 years had passed since Richard first met Paul Whitmore on that rain-soaked night in Kensington. The streets, once harsh and unrelenting, now felt like distant memories, softened by the growth, effort, and guidance that had transformed his life. He had walked again, first with support, then unassisted, feeling each step as a small miracle, each one a testament to resilience, courage, and the extraordinary kindness of strangers. Richard's life had shifted entirely. No longer confined to selling candy on the streets, he had returned to school, pouring himself into studies with the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. His illness was a thing of the past, replaced by newfound strength and vitality. Yet even in success he remembered the streets, the people he had encountered, and the injustices he had witnessed, understanding now that true power lay in helping others rise, not in material accumulation. On a crisp morning in early spring, Richard sat at his small desk, drafting a cover letter to a prominent company downtown. The ink flowed smoothly, each word meticulously chosen. He described his experience, his education, his commitment to growth, but most importantly, he conveyed integrity, resilience, and character, the qualities that no resume could quantify, but that defined him entirely. Pausing, he looked at the framed photograph of Paul, Mariana, and himself on the rooftop of the rehab center, city lights twinkling behind them. He smiled faintly. This letter isn't just a resume. It's a testament to a journey, a story of courage and perseverance. After a final read, he attached his resume and hit send. The moment was anticlimactic in appearance but monumental in significance. Somewhere in the electronic ether, Richard's potential was now formally recognized, and he knew it. Hours later, Paul received a notification on his phone. The subject line made him pause. His eyes scanned the message. The name at the top was familiar. Richard Henderson. Recognition struck instantly. He leaned back, allowing a smile to spread across his face, a mix of pride, relief, and deep emotion. He called Richard immediately, the connection bridging the two worlds once more. "Richard," he said, his voice catching slightly, "I just saw your application. You did it. I can't tell you how proud I am." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Paul, I couldn't have done it without you, without everything you did for me." "No," Paul said firmly, "this is all you. I only provided the tools. You built the life. You built yourself, and now the world gets to see what I've known all along." Weeks passed as Richard navigated interviews and meetings. His combination of street-hardened resilience, academic excellence, and emotional intelligence impressed every employer. But the final interview, the one that would determine the trajectory of his career, was with Paul himself, this time in a professional capacity, not as the benefactor who had once saved him. The day of the interview, Richard entered Paul's office with calm confidence. The room had changed little, polished wood gleaming under the sunlight, but the energy was different now. This time he was no longer the boy in the wheelchair. He was a man transformed by trials, courage, and friendship. Paul stood as Richard approached, smiling warmly. "Welcome, Richard," he said. "Please, sit." The conversation flowed naturally, not just about skills and strategy, but about vision, character, and the human values that had become central to both their lives. Richard shared ideas for company culture, employee development, and community outreach, drawing on his own experiences to illuminate the importance of empathy, leadership, and resilience. Paul listened, nodded, and finally, with genuine warmth, said, "Richard, I don't need to tell you this, but I will anyway. You're not just hired, you're trusted. I can't imagine anyone better to lead our human resources division. Welcome aboard." Emotions swelled in Richard's chest. Pride, gratitude, and joy intermingled with the memories of hardship, pain, and determination. He extended his hand to Paul, and this time the handshake was not of mentorship or gratitude, but of equals, partners in a shared mission of transformation, trust, and meaningful impact. Later, as Richard settled into his new role, he took a moment to reflect. From the streets of Kensington to the polished offices of a thriving company, every struggle, every tear, every moment of courage had brought him here. Mariana had flourished alongside him, overcoming her own demons, and Paul had transformed from a man hollowed by wealth to one fulfilled by connection, purpose, and humanity. Richard understood something profound. Success was not measured by titles or salary, but by the lives one touched, the courage one summoned, and the love one shared. And he also realized that sometimes the universe orchestrates encounters with precision, using moments of crisis as catalysts for destiny. Mariana, the girl in need, had been the tool fate used to draw him into this extraordinary chapter of his life. Standing in his office window, Richard looked out over the city, a city that had once seemed indifferent, harsh, and unyielding. Now, it felt alive, full of possibility. He thought of the alleys, the hospital corridors, the therapy sessions, the laughter, the tears, and the rooftop moments that had forged him anew, and he whispered a quiet promise to the universe. "I will honor this journey. I will make the world better, not just for me, but for everyone who ever felt powerless. I will live fully, love openly, and never forget where I came from." Paul, watching from across the room, recognized the depth of Richard's transformation. He had seen many success stories, but few with the raw, unfiltered humanity he witnessed in Richard, and he knew without doubt that this was only the beginning of a legacy that would endure far beyond office walls, salaries, and accolades, a legacy born of courage, gratitude, and the unbreakable bonds forged between unlikely friends. Richard had settled into his new life with a quiet confidence. The transformation over the past 2 years was nothing short of miraculous, not just in his own body, but in his mind and spirit. Every morning, he rose with purpose, ready to face the challenges of his role as Director of Human Resources, aware that each decision he made could shape the lives of hundreds of employees. Mariana, too, had grown into a radiant woman. Her journey from addiction to recovery had been painful and arduous, but she had emerged with a profound sense of self-worth and strength. She was now pursuing a degree in social work, determined to give back to the community that had once nurtured her recovery. She often visited Richard at his office, bringing stories of students she was helping, families she was counseling, and small victories that reminded them both of the profound ripple effects of compassion and courage. One Friday afternoon, the three of them, Richard, Mariana, and Paul, met for lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking the city skyline. They spoke about the past, their shared struggles, and the unexpected turns that had led them to this moment. Laughter flowed easily, unburdened by fear, regret, or doubt. It was a celebration of life reclaimed, of relationships forged in the crucible of adversity. Paul, stirring his coffee, leaned back in his chair and said softly, "I've always measured success in numbers, deals, and influence. But what you both have taught me is that the true measure of life is in the courage to face pain, the willingness to help, and the strength to rise after falling." Richard nodded. "I've learned that too. Strength isn't just physical, it's emotional, moral. It's about lifting others even when your own path is hard," Mariana added, her voice steady and full of resolve. "And hope can be contagious. If you survive and thrive, you show others it's possible. That's the real legacy." After lunch, they took a walk through the streets Richard had once navigated daily. Kensington had changed little, still marked by the echoes of struggle, but the trio moved with a sense of purpose and ownership that contrasted sharply with the chaos around them. Richard paused outside a small alley, the location where he had first intervened on that rainy night. Memories surged, fear, adrenaline, and the sense of being powerless, all tempered now by triumph and gratitude. He turned to Paul. "It's strange. I thought saving her would just change her life, but it changed mine too. And yours." Paul smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. "It did, and it will continue to, in ways we can't even imagine yet." Mariana squeezed Richard's hand. "And it all started with a single act of courage. You risked yourself when no one else would. That's what set all of this in motion." Richard let the weight of her words settle. Courage had always been part of him, even when circumstances tried to suppress it. But seeing the tangible outcomes, the recovery, the friendships, the opportunities, he understood fully the power of his own resilience. Every moment of struggle had led to transformation, every hardship a stepping stone to purpose. Back at Paul's office, Richard finally reviewed the first quarterly report under his leadership. It wasn't just numbers, it was evidence of change, growth, and human impact. Policies he had implemented to support employee well-being, mentorship programs inspired by his own journey, and initiatives for community engagement were taking root. The company, once a sterile symbol of profit and influence, had begun reflecting the values of empathy, integrity, and resilience that had guided Richard's life. Late that evening, as Richard prepared to leave the office, Paul caught up with him. They stood together in the elevator, a quiet camaraderie bridging the gap between mentor and friend. Paul said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think wealth was the ultimate measure of success. Now I see it's how we use it to lift others that truly matters." Richard nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "And it only works if you have people to share it with, people who matter." Paul extended his hand, and Richard shook it firmly. But this time, the gesture wasn't transactional, symbolic, or formal. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle, triumph, and enduring human connection. Outside, the city lights flickered like stars brought down to earth. Richard breathed deeply, aware of the journey he had traversed. The rain-soaked streets, the hospital corridors, the rehab sessions, and the rooftop moments that had shaped him. He thought of Mariana, of Paul, of the countless small acts of courage and compassion that had intersected to form his present life. And he knew that every challenge, every risk, and every victory had been part of a grand tapestry of purpose, resilience, and transformation. As he returned home that night, he paused at the window looking out over the city. The streets that once symbolized struggle now symbolized opportunity, the embodiment of human tenacity. He whispered softly to himself, "I am not just walking, I am living, fully, and I will honor this life, these lessons, and these people, every single day." Mariana, watching from her apartment across the street, smiled faintly. She knew that their stories, intertwined by fate and courage, would continue to echo through their lives, not just as memories, but as a living legacy, a testament to the power of human connection, empathy, and resilience. Paul, observing from his office tower, reflected on the journey as well. He realized that wealth and influence, no matter how vast, were nothing compared to the fulfillment that comes from touching lives meaningfully. He had gained something irreplaceable: insight, gratitude, and a sense of purpose renewed by the lives of Richard and Mariana. And as the night settled over Philadelphia, 3 lives stood irrevocably transformed, bound together by acts of courage, trust, and unwavering hope. The story of Richard Henderson, once a boy trapped by circumstance, now a man walking confidently into the future, was a reminder that even in the darkest alleys, in the depths of human struggle, light can emerge. Hope can be cultivated, and through courage and compassion, legacies are born.